and thank you for joining us for week 4 session of 1 Peter, A Living Hope. At the dinner table, what are some conversation topics that tend to make sparks fly?
Religion.
Religion?
Politics.
Religion and politics. And today we're going to be talking about both. But the reason why we're going to talk about both of them today is because Peter addresses them. Now, on April 12th, in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama for breaking a city injunction. He was protesting and picketing against segregation in the South. Now, Dr. King intended to break that city ordinance. He knew what he was doing. It was a strategy called civil disobedience, a term coined by Henry David Thoreau, which uses nonviolent interventions to peacefully protest injustices. Civil disobedience operates under the premise that unjust law is no law at all. Now, upon his arrest, Martin Luther King Jr. was taken to a Birmingham jail, and an ally of his smuggled in a local newspaper, which contained an open letter named A Call for Unity, directed at King and acknowledging that while there might be some social injustices, the only proper way to handle them was in the court systems, not in the city streets. Well, 4 days later, King responded with a letter of his own, now famously entitled Letter from a Birmingham Jail, defending the strategy of nonviolent resistance to institutionalized injustices, and he used biblical and theological authorities to do it. King mentions the book of Daniel, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were legally ordered to worship the king's golden idol, but when they refused only worshiping God, they were thrown into the furnace. Now, King wasn't simply referencing the Bible because he was a pastor, nor because he was culturally appropriating his letter to the American South. No, the call to unity was actually authored by 8 Birmingham pastors. This wasn't just a debate on injustice, though that is a worthy debate in and of itself. This was a Christian debate between those committed to living out the mission of Jesus Christ, and the men were arguing over the correct application of God's word in the social sphere and the roles that laws, politics, and religion all play together. This was asking a grander question: how do we as Christians live in a society where our laws and our lawmakers can enforce things contrary to the will of God? How do we navigate in a cultural context where those who do good can suffer at the hands of injustice? And how do we operate and endure as citizens of the kingdom of heaven while living in the realm of man? The past few lessons, we've talked about doing everything out of reverence for God. We've also discussed the concept of being ransomed, bought with a high price. Now, the concepts of being ransomed and doing things out of reverence for God fit together because those who have been ransomed by Jesus have a response of an overflowing love that's willing to lay down their life in service for another. And all of this is done out of recognition for what God has done for us. Now, how do those concepts fit with living with authorities? It can be difficult to do that. It's difficult to live under authorities who, at best, don't share our convictions, and at worst are unjust and ungodly. Peter's going to help us with this by telling us to look to Jesus on how we live out our lives and God's call in the world. And the answer is not easy. Part of living holy and reverent lives is the call to lay down our lives, which is hard to do. But Christ gives us a good example of service to others, service while suffering, and service as our good shepherd. According to this passage, we are to be subject to everyone, especially the authorities that God has placed over us. Yes, Christians in every circumstance, citizens, servants, neighbors, shepherds, pastors, spouses, are all called to serve others. We are all to be subject to those that we agree with and to those we disagree with. Verse 17 says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. But we are willing to be subject out of reverence for God. Yes, part of our identity and participation in God's mission includes the willingness to lead lives of service and love for others. As we discussed last week, holiness and obedience are not carried out just for themselves. They're carried out to glorify God and to spread His goodness. Love of God and love of others are the reasons why we obey God and pursue holiness. They're inextricably bound together because we've been given so much. We are willing to lay our lives down because Jesus laid down everything for us. Now, the differences between submission and obeying is a worthy discussion. Submission means arranging one's life under. Submitting to an authority still allows for freedom on how we follow and adhere to orders. However, obedience, carrying out the will of, is a much deeper form of allegiance. So we are called to submit to the laws that govern us. However, our ultimate allegiance is to God alone. So no matter what your political affiliation is, if you choose to have one, and no matter whether you agree with the powers in office or feel like justice is best applied through redeeming injustices, you are to respect the order that God has laid down, because in the end, all good laws and good ordinances reflect His goodness and care for the world. Let me qualify that again. All good laws that are consistent with the heart and the mission of God, are to be submitted to out of reverence for God, no matter who the enforcer of the law is. However, we do know that sometimes wicked people get into positions of power, and that is extremely hard. Even so, God still commands us to serve others, even if we suffer for doing good. So we are to serve even while suffering. Peter turns to servants, knowing that some of them are being mistreated for obeying God instead of obeying their earthly masters. And Peter's encouragement to these suffering servants is continue doing good. Even if you suffer, look to Jesus and still do good. Jesus has actually laid out an example for us, an example that He calls us to, an example that we must follow. Specifically, it is to serve and to suffer sacrificially for others. We're called to servanthood. And why have we been called to this? Well, verse 21 tells us, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in His steps. In 1 Peter 2:20, Peter frames suffering for Christ as a grace, meaning that if you belong to God and standing out in the world causes you to suffer, this is actually a grace in your life. Now, this isn't Peter's way of trying to sugarcoat suffering, but what he is saying, just like we talked about those living stones, is that you might be rejected in this world, you might suffer for doing good, but you will never, ever be rejected by Jesus. He will never reject His people. And in verse 21, it says, "For to this you have been called." The this meaning suffering on Christ's behalf and suffering for righteousness' sake. "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in His footsteps." Peter's encouragement for suffering Christians, both then and now, is that if you are suffering because of God, because of doing His good, look to Jesus and know that He has perfectly illustrated what it is like to suffer for doing good. He lived the perfect life, and yet He was scorned. He was reviled, and He didn't revile in return. He was innocent, but He suffered and died among the guilty. But because we bear Christ's name, there's no way we can escape suffering in this world. In this way, we're also obligated to suffering, meaning that there's no other path of imitation. If Jesus suffered for doing good in this world and we bear His name, we too must suffer for doing good in this world. But thankfully, we are not without a Savior who understands our suffering. Jesus has gone before us. Even in the midst of suffering, He guides and mediates for us, preserving us, strengthening us, and motivating us to keep going. He is the ultimate good example in illustration, in obligation, and in mediation, showing us that we can trust Him. Another incredible action that Jesus illustrates for us is entrusting lives to the Father. And in this way, He shows us service of others, service while suffering, and service as our good shepherd. We can endure suffering because we can trust ourselves to Jesus. My campus minister used to say, "How do we know we can trust Him?" You can always trust someone who would die for you. And it's true. Few of us would choose a path of suffering if we knew that there was any other way. But Hebrews says that for the joy that was set before him, Jesus endured the cross. Jesus knew the pattern of suffering as it was told in Isaiah 53 of the suffering service. He knew that coming to earth would involve him humbling himself and taking on human form and being mocked and ridiculed and wounded. And he chose it anyway for you, for us. And we think about all the injustices that we can encounter in this world, and don't get me wrong, some of them are egregious. But there was no greater injustice carried out than what happened on the cross, about how the perfect, spotless lamb was brutally slain. And when we think about that and look to that, we know that there's no earthly experience that could ever compete with his. And yet Jesus gave himself. He surrendered his will. He surrendered his spirit over to the Father, trusting in God's goodness and mercy and justice. Jesus modeled for us that he believed God the Father was the just judge. And so Jesus paid the penalty so that all of our debt would be cleared. Jesus, as our good shepherd, not only shows us what it is to entrust ourselves to God, but he has also given us every reason to entrust ourselves to him. So whether you face injustice at the hands of a political power or an employer or a spouse, you can run to the shepherd and overseer of your souls, knowing that he will never let any harm befall his precious little lambs. So are you entrusting everything to Christ? Know that we can serve others and serve while suffering, because the greatest servant of all, Jesus, gave his life for us so that he could be the shepherd and the overseer of our souls. So how are you applying today's lesson?
I work for an elected official, and I'm lucky to work for somebody who's very honest and approaches his job with integrity. And I've seen that cost him a lot in the process of it, and in a system that maybe sometimes doesn't uphold that or doesn't celebrate that. And just even now, as we go through a campaign season and seeing things that are said about him that are not true, or said about others, and the way that just learning how to walk through that without reacting, or what's our part in that, and how do we trust that God protects our character. It's not up to us to defend it sometimes, and how kind of that wrestling is something that is made me think about.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I mean, you're really seeing that in true and living color in front of you. Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and that makes me think, nobody wants to suffer.
No.
This is something that's very difficult for us to really comprehend or embrace, because suffering isn't fun. And so when you bring up that example, I think about how do we persevere through suffering? And it takes me right back to what you said, that Christ endured the cross because of the hope or the joy that was set before him. And when we look at persevering through our suffering, the only way that we're going to do it and maintain our integrity or maintain what we're called to be and do is to obey, is to keep our eyes on Jesus, keep our eyes on that hope and that joy that's before us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Well, as a police officer, I every day in my career am willing to make sacrifice for people that I've never even met, but I'm not willing to compromise my integrity or my ethics to do it. Many times in my career, I've had someone who easily could have gone to jail because that was the law, that I've taken for counseling or for treatment, or some other way of diverting them from that criminal justice system and getting them help. And it's just going that little bit extra to help our fellow man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, for your service, and second of all, for your story. And
Thank you for letting me do it.
Listen, what I love about what you just said is about how you encounter moments in your work where what is legally applicable is not always the will of God. And you actually, it sounds like you are restoring people by helping them and getting their needs met and not just enforcing law on them.
Discretion is very important
Yes.
with what I
Well,
do.
thank you for modeling that so well. I thank you for that story. That's wonderful.
Sarah, one of the things that comes to my mind is that, one, this is a hard lesson. I mean, having the call of Christ to bear up like Jesus did and to pick up our cross and to bear up under unjust suffering. And, I've had many people come and ask me, about this. And I often will say, it's never for one person to tell another person, today's your day to be a martyr, or today's your day to pick up your cross. I think it's a very holy moment when people have that moment of testing, and it's their period of being that person of integrity. And when they do make that kind of decision and step up for the Lord, it's one of the most powerful witnesses of the gospel, because they are actually manifesting Jesus in that moment. And it's inspiring to the people that watch.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is there's a lot of discernment and a lot of nuance to this, right? And of course, we're not called to literally go on a cross and die for others, but do we have a heart of willingness? Do we have a life that is willing to lay down the comforts that we so cherish for the sake of someone else's betterment? And I'm glad that we're discussing this. I hope that you all continue to discuss this as you get into your small groups and go through your questions. And just know that you have been empowered to follow Christ in every way because he is your good example and he's equipped you for that.